Hi there. Well, you saw these blocks in my last video. Now I'm going to put them together. I am going to quilt each of them, and the first thing I do, I take the block to my ironing table. I don't like to mark with chalk or pencil or pins or tape. What I do is normally I will take one of these big blocks, fold the corners together, give it a press. Give it a good press because there's lots of seams there, Linda. You've got to make sure that you can see that crease when it's on top of the backing so that you can follow that easily. And then I take the corner again, fold it down. I do that twice, give it a good steam. I'm not steaming it now because my camera will get steamy. There you go. So I make sure that it's pressed well, and I'm going to do that one more time. Just fold it over again. And most of the big blocks, I will like to quilt them from corner to corner and do a diagonal row. And then I do it in the opposite direction. And for most of the projects that I do, I just use my walking foot and I quilt straight lines, or I quilt diagonal lines from corner to corner. So I can see those creases in these big blocks. I don't have to mark the lines. Then I make sure that I press my back, the one that has the batting attached to it already, and I place the block I pressed just now on top and make sure that corner to corner is where I want it to go. But see, when it's laying on the table and under the sewing machine, I can see those press lines, and all I do is just put them underneath my presser foot, follow the press line, and sew the layers together. It's really easy, and it makes a nice design, especially for these scrappy blocks that have some motifs on them or some pattern on them. It will work with both sides, and see it, look, it just went right through the diagonal of that on the back side. How lucky was that, eh? So now I'm just going to make those other 2 lines or 3 lines on each side of that. Do the same thing. I back stitch because sometimes the stitches like to come out before I get to the next stage. But there I am. It takes me about 10-15 minutes to just quilt one of those blocks diagonally both ways. It's pretty easy. So when it comes to do the other row, sometimes I'll just take it back to the iron and give it another crease in the center, because the center is the longest line and you want that one to be straight. So sometimes I take it back to the ironing board and just do another crease, but then what I do is just stitch the diagonal, and it's so much easier to quilt the second direction because where those first rows ended is where I'm going to start, and I just go match them up at the side and sew across to the other side, and each of those rows are pretty short. They're not very hard to do. So here it is, that's done. Both sides look pretty good. And then I just do a little bit of trimming at the edges, and I make sure that they are going to be the correct size. Every once in a while, a little swill or a little movement causes a little bump. So I just take a little bit off the edges and make sure that all of the finished blocks are going to be the same size. That's very important when you want to join them up together. Here's a little tip. I keep a dry sponge in my sewing area because I use batting a lot and because I cut a lot of batting. the grooves of the rotary cutter, force it into the cutting mat. So if I just lightly do a swirly with my dry sponge, it tends to pull out all those fibers, and then it's easier to make cuts on the board, and it preserves the board a little bit. All the blocks are quilted now, and it's time to put them together with the leftover bits that I have. When I am deciding what to use for a sashing, I look at what's left over from the project that I have done or from the scraps that I have that I'm going to consider. If I have enough of one color, I would choose to do one color in all of the sashings. But I have made many quilts with multiple fabrics for sashings, and it's very scrappy, and it still works fine. And if you pick the right colors, it will work together. Anyway, what I've got here is some of this color from this side, and I had enough pieces that I could make sashing for one side. And I'm going to put that color on this side. Now you must recall that the other side are those yellow and white shoe fly blocks. And they're very light colored. But I want them to sort of make a marriage with this side. So I do have quite a bit of this blue here, and I'm going to make the sashing on the other side from this one. Now, one of the sashings has to be wider than the other one because you have to fold it over. And looking at what I've got, the one that's going to fold over is the blue one. And the one that is this rusty color is going to be just a single layer. And every time I make a quilt as you go, I always make a little sample before I start so I get the measurements that I want to have. And for this particular quilt, the one that folds over is going to be cut in a 2-inch width. And the one that is a single layer is going to be 1 1/2 inches. And that is going to work for what I want. And it will be a nice sashing for the quilt. And you see, I just used scraps of the pieces that I cut off to do my sample. That's fine. It gives me an idea of what I'm doing, and it helps me to remember measure first, then sew, because I don't want to sew a whole lot of things on and have to take it all out. That's the worst thing ever. I hate taking out things. So I've got some strips cut, 1 1/2, and these are going to go on this side, and the 2-inch strip is going on the other side, but I'm going to fold it in half and sew it on the other side. I'll show you how I do it. Also, you will notice that this is a one-way pattern. The boots want to be in an orientation so the top is at the top and the bottom of the boot is at the bottom. Likewise, these cows are one way. You don't want them twisted sideways. So when I have these on my wall, I have to think when I take them over to my sewing table that they are going to be in the correct orientation. And that is very important to me because I want all of the one-way patterns to go in the same direction. So when I take them off the wall, I put them on my desk so I know which one is going to go next to the other. And I'll start here. And a second thing, before I actually start the quilting process or the sashing process, I make sure that these blocks are the same size, and I've squared them up on my cutting board before I put them on the wall, just to make sure that none of them are longer than the others. That's important. So here are my 3 blocks on the table ready to go, and they're in the correct orientation. So I'm going to start with this one and put the first sashing down on this side. So this one has this sashing. But you know, I find it's a lot easier to do this the other way up, because I like to use the folded over piece on the top as I'm sewing. So I'm going to have to think twice, and then I'll set them on my desk differently next time. Always think about what you're doing. Make sure you've got the right orientation for these things. Otherwise, you might have the colors on the reverse side. That's not terrible because they both will work with either side. So I've lined up here at the side. I've lined up here at the side all the layers. The brown one is at the bottom facing up. The side that is there is that way, and this folded one that is 2 inches folded in half is at the top. And I'm just going to use the width of my presser foot, and that's why I always test first. I make sure that I test it to make sure that it's going to work. If I don't test, I'm unhappy. And I've been doing this a long time, and I still test. So I just use the side of my presser foot along the side of all these layers. Ta-da. Then I just trim off this extra piece because I can use it somewhere else. And I'm going to trim off this extra piece because I can use it somewhere else. I slide it under there. All right, now. Looking good. So the next one is going to go here. So I put that over top. And it is in the correct orientation, feet down, heads up. And this time I can sew it this way along here, or I am going to flip it over and sew it this way because I can see better this way. And when I set the next lot out, I'm going to make sure I have it the correct way for me to sew this. And once again, all I'm doing is the edge of this piece I sewed on the bottom, I flip it out, and here it is out the side. If you think that's a bit too wide, you can always trim that down. It really is what you want it to look like. And you have to make sure that it's going to suit your style. I like it this wide. You might like it less wide. You might like it more wide. You just have to figure it out. And I know they're the same length, so I have to hold them together at this end. So stretch sometimes. There's 2 rows of stitching. So on that side, I've got my sashing done. On this side, I have one more step to go. Now it's important to make another decision. I have light brown thread in the top and I have white in the bottom bobbin. So do I want this to be white on here? No. Do I want this to be light brown on here? No, I want this to be blue on here. Because I chose blue, I will sew on top of here in blue thread. That way it won't stand out. But you can do a couple of things. You can put a row of stitching on this side to hold it together. And then just for decoration, you can put another row of stitching on this side so it looks like a flat felled seam. And that is perfectly fine to do. I've seen lots of people, and I've also made stitches that are zigzag. And I zigzag them, and I zigzag them. But that's a bit more playful in my opinion. I like just a straight line personally, and that's usually what I do. But I always try to match the color with my sashing. So I'm going to change thread right now and put blue on the top, and on the bobbin, probably I'll put a light brown. I was thinking I would just leave it white, but I think I'll put a light brown on the bottom. So I'm just going to change thread. Should have thought of that earlier. Now, there is a tendency sometimes to try to pull that apart, but that's not what you want to do. You want to bring those 2 seam allowances close together, like that. Fold that over so that this edge is just over the seam that you stitched it on before. And the nice thing about this is you only have 18 inches to sew at this stage. So on the back side, the stitching should form right along the crease that you've made. Now, as I said, you could do a double row of stitching and make it look like a flat felled seam. And that simply would be making a seam along this side as a decorative stitch on this side. This is a Western type quilt. I could easily do that. But there's first one on. Now the second one, remember what I'm doing. Brown on the top, blue on the bottom. Oh, that's not long enough. Here we go. Make sure I have the folded part there. But like I said, I'm going to be very confusing and turn this over because I like sewing on the other side better. All right, flip. Making sure that the boot and the cow feet are all on the same side. I put a few stitches in at the end, and that needle holds it for me. It's on my other hand. There. And open this out under here. Just fold that up a bit. Take away any of those extra threads while I see them. And just sew this down. First row done. Now before I go and put this back up on the wall and do the next row, I always put that sashing, double sashing on the top before I hang it up, because when I get it off the wall next time, I want to be fast and efficient and just sew the next row together. So I turn it this way, and you see these little bits that are out at the end. I have to cut those off and make this easier to sew. So I'm going to put the brown side up here and the blue side underneath on this side. Brown, blue. Now, do I have a piece of brown long enough to go all that way? Maybe not. So I might have to join two together. So this is going on the bottom, and the blue is on the top. Now this has a little bit of a curve to it, so I'm going to turn it the other way around. It's just easier. There. My extra hand. this isn't long enough for this side, so it will need a joiner as well. Put that in there. Okay. Now I can do this. I keep this up on my lap because it tends to be heavier now that it's joined together. Sometimes it's a bit more awkward, but it's not too bad. There. Good. So when I finish a row like that, I always turn it over and make sure that the back side has no batting showing. It shouldn't have. It's been trimmed and it's been measured, but there's always that one time that you're going to find, oops, a daisy problems. So now I'll put this back up on the wall. Sew the next 3 rows together, and then it will be done. But basically, that's the process. I'll show you how I join the next row when I get it ready. Here I am just starting the last rows. Blue on the yellow side and light brown on the cowboy side. Keep all the edges even. Just take your time and make sure that you use an even seam allowance as you're going through this process. So when it's time to turn it over and join the last one, just make sure that you keep the edges even at the top. You've got your flap pressed out evenly and alongside the back side of the piece you're putting it onto. And there's that nice space between the edges on this little flap, and if you've done the seam allowances quite evenly, the presser foot just fits right in there on that space. Just make sure you have the edges aligned together when you sew this. Sometimes it takes a bit of time to get everything situated. If you need to use pins, put them in and use pins, or those little clips that people buy. I'm happier doing it just by stopping and starting and aligning things and keeping the bottom edges even and the top edges even. And sometimes I put my hand underneath and hold the underside. But that's how I get them to line up. And if you are matching points, you have to be a little more careful about matching the points. Now when it's time to join this last row of 3 squares to the ones that have previously all been quilted together, I take the time to put a few pins in where the joins are, where the sashings are, so that those lines are going to match up. And I just follow the same process. I match the top together. I lay it down flat on my sewing table. Make sure I do it from the edge that I want to do because that's my comfort level. I don't try to do it upside down. I always like to see this little bit of sashing between the edge and the top sashing that's going to get folded over. But I just take my time and sort it out, hold it tightly, get my sewing machine to sew a little bit, then my extra hand, the needle and the presser foot, and then I can sort of flip and flop them around a bit and make sure that the edges of the sashing are even with the edge of the quilted piece that I'm adjoining to it. Sometimes it takes a bit of time. If you're not accustomed to the bulk, it's kind of hard to do sometimes. But if you've got a little process that you use, it works a charm. Just take your time. Don't try to spin it all out really quickly. And when you get to the part where you've got your pin, for heaven's sakes, take it out, because you'll break the needle otherwise. So I just continue on down the row. Sometimes I have my left hand holding the fabric and quilted pieces to the side so that they move along, because my tabletop quilting table is higher than the desktop, so sometimes the quilt gets caught on the edge of the quilting table. So I have to be aware of that. And sometimes when there are lots of edges and lots of seams, because when I do these quilted projects, I've got lots of seams. If they come to the edge, I have to just be aware. Sometimes I'll do a little basting stitch across the edge of the seam to hold it together. And that way it doesn't sort of twist or become tangled up in my presser foot. But when I get to the end of this one, it's just a matter of holding it. See where my left hand is? It's underneath. And I'm just holding the bottom of both of those rows together. Parallel bottom is really essential. Don't have one up on a skew. It will make the process harder to look good when you're done and put the binding on. So now I just have to sew that piece of blue sashing down. I fold the part that I've just sewed on, and because it's 18 inches, it's folded in half to 9 inches. I mean, that's all that ever goes in between my needle and the sewing machine. I don't roll up a whole lot of stuff, and there's not a lot there to have to maneuver. And I just run my finger underneath the blue sashing to make sure that all of those seam allowances are aligned. And sometimes I might tip the bottom one underneath so that it lies flatter in there. I just want them to meet. I don't want them to be separated. They just meet together in that little channel that you've created with the sashings. But that's not so bad. When I get to a seam like I've got now, where there's lots of bulk, just take your time. Make sure that you can tuck that little edge underneath, and hopefully if you've got something as bold as this blue on yellow and white, you want to have those meet, and you want to have them not a quarter of an inch away. So overall, this was a really fun project. I enjoyed making all of these things and using up some more of the things that I've got in my closet. I'm working away at all my fabric. So here I am. I'm now putting the binding on the edge. I have my bindings cut at 2 1/2 inches. I fold them in half lengthwise and press it. When I'm sewing along the edge of the fabric, I make sure to just make it straight. Keep the seam that I'm sewing as even as I can. When I get to the corner, I stop a quarter of an inch from the edge and I backstitch. Now I will show you how I make my mitered corner. I turn the fabric 90 degrees, and you can see I'm putting my thumb right at the corner and making a fold. When that fold can be twisted back and forth like I'm doing, then I know that piece of corner fold is going to be even and work well with the next step to finish it. And then I start sewing again at the top of the fabric, align all the edges once again, and just keep on going all the way to the next corner. So here is the finishing the corner. I've folded the folded piece of binding over the edge, but when I get to the corner now, I put my finger into the corner and push out that little bit of fabric so that it's pushed out. Then I fold carefully the binding to the quilt in both directions, so I have a miter made at the corner. And if you're lucky, it meets exactly perfectly so that you can stitch to the point, leave the needle in the fabric, and then lift the presser foot, turn the fabric 90 degrees, take a minute to straighten out and even out the fabric, make sure you've got it correct, and then I run my finger down through the fold to make sure all of those ends of quilted fabric are evenly distributed in the binding. And then I just continue on until the next corner. There's one more little step afterwards. Always make sure that your seam allowance is straight, and when you fold the binding over in half, it should come to the edge of the folded binding. That's what makes a firm edge to the quilt. And if you are going to go to the fair and enter your quilt into a competition, you want to make sure that all of the stitching is also even on the front and the back. Now that is a task if you are machine stitching. But practice, practice, practice always helps. So if you practice binding and you are going to machine stitch the whole thing, here are some tips if you are going to enter your quilt at a fall fair or in a competition. If you are machine stitching your binding, make sure that the row of stitching on the back side and the front side are uniformly distant from the edge. Secondly, make sure that the space in the binding is filled with the edge of the quilt. Try to have your edges all straight and butting up against this fold. A third thing that you should try is when you do this mitered corner, take the time to put a stitch here in that little crease that you have. Put a hand stitch or two, a little slip stitch to close that gap on the front and on the back. That is one of the things that judges look at and make sure that your points are nice points. And of course, when talking about points, these would never win a prize at the fair because there is no point. There wasn't enough seam allowance to keep the point in most of the things that are here. That's why I love to do scrappy bits and anything goes. And if the child that is going to receive this drags it around the floor or makes tents out of it over furniture chairs, it's fine. It's going to be a serviceable quilt and lots of fun for a child to have. And it is going to be warm because it has a good batting in it. So there it is. All I have to do is pick off all these loose threads that I get all over the place. And I do make my little stitch in the corner. And that's a hand stitch job. But it's done. And I'd say that putting the whole binding on took me about half an hour from the start to the finish because I left my video recorder go and it's at 27 minutes now. And I must say I'm going to edit all that out because who wants to watch somebody sew a binding on from start to finish? Not me. So I'm going to edit quite a bit of it out, but I've picked out some things that are helpful if you are going to make bindings, sew them on by machine. This is how I do it, and it works fine for me. I've got 4 grandchildren, and I've made about 6 quilts for them each from the time they were babies to now the time that they're in their 20s and almost 30s. So the ones that were made for them when they were babies, their mom put away one of the quilts each, but the rest of them got machine washed every week, dragged around, out to campfires. They have been well used and there's no way to salvage them anymore. So that's the way it goes when you make children's quilts. I think that's the way it goes anyway. I'd rather see the quilt being used and keeping the child warm and cozy, and that's the way it goes with me. So here's the end of this one. I'll just pop it up on the wall and take a couple pictures so you can see the finished product. So once again, if you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. See you next time. I'll have another project.